The firefighter who saved everyone, except the child who saved him. A story of sacrifice, second chances, and how sometimes the people we rescue end up rescuing us. Captain Jake Morrison had answered 12,847 emergency calls in his 23 years with the Denver Fire Department. He could tell you the exact number because he kept track of every single one in a leather-bound journal his late wife had given him when he made captain 15 years ago. Each entry was brief but precise. Date, time, location, nature of the emergency, outcome. Sometimes he added a small note: family cat survived. Elderly man refused to evacuate until we found his wedding ring. 3-year-old boy asked if I was Superman. The small moments that made the job worth the sleepless nights and the constant fear that lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. What Jake didn't write in that journal were the calls that haunted him. The ones that played on repeat in his mind during the long hours between sunset and dawn. The faces he couldn't save. The voices that called out from smoke and flame and fell silent before he could reach them. Call number 12,848 would be different. It would be the call that changed everything. Though Jake wouldn't understand that until much later, when the smoke had cleared and the real story finally came to light. It started, like so many of his worst days, with the sound of the alarm tearing through the firehouse at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October. Jake rolled out of his narrow bunk with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this thousands of times before, his body moving automatically while his mind struggled to catch up. Structure fire, 1247 Maple Street. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the intercom. Multiple residents trapped on upper floors. All units respond code red. Maple Street. Jake knew the address before they turned the corner and saw the flames reaching toward the sky like desperate fingers. It was the Riverside Children's Home, a 3-story brick building that housed 42 kids aged 6 to 17. Kids who had nowhere else to go, no one else to count on. The scene that greeted them was every firefighter's nightmare. Flames were pouring from the 2nd and 3rd floor windows, and smoke was billowing so thick it looked like a living thing, dark and malevolent against the pre-dawn sky. Scared children in pajamas huddled behind the barricades the police had set up, some crying, others standing in stunned silence as they watched their home burn. Jake's trained eyes assessed the situation in seconds. The fire had started on the 2nd floor and was spreading fast. The building's old wiring and wooden interior were feeding the flames like kindling. They had minutes, maybe less, before the upper floors became death traps. Morrison, take Alpha Team through the front entrance. Chief Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos. Beta Team goes around back. We've got reports of kids still inside on the 3rd floor. As Jake strapped on his breathing apparatus, a small figure broke through the police line and ran straight toward him. It was a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair sticking up in all directions and eyes wide with panic. Please! The boy grabbed Jake's jacket with both hands. Please, you have to find Emma. She's still up there. She's only 6 and she's scared of the dark and she hides when she gets scared. Hey, slow down. Jake knelt to the boy's level, noting the kid's thin frame and the way his pajama shirt hung loose on his small shoulders. What's your name, buddy? Tommy. Tommy Chin. I lived here. His voice cracked. Emma's my roommate's little sister. She was in the bathroom when the alarms went off and now nobody can find her. Jake felt the familiar clench in his stomach, the one that came whenever children were involved. Which room, Tommy? Do you know where she might hide? Room 318. There's a closet behind the dresser where she goes when she has nightmares. Please, you have to find her. Jake placed a steady hand on Tommy's shoulder. I'm going to find her, son. I promise. It was a promise Jake had made countless times before, but never when the stakes felt this high. Maybe it was the desperation in Tommy's eyes, or the way the kid stood there in his 2 big pajamas trusting a stranger with the most important thing in his world. Either way, Jake meant it with every fiber of his being. Inside the building, the heat hit him like a physical blow. Even through his protective gear, Jake could feel the temperature climbing toward levels that would make survival impossible. The smoke was so thick his flashlight beam couldn't penetrate more than a few feet ahead. He made his way up the main staircase, testing each step carefully. The old building was groaning around him, timbers shifting and settling as the fire ate away at its bones. On the third floor, the hallway was like a vision of hell, flames licking at the ceiling, wallpaper curling and blackening, the air so hot it shimmered. Room 318 was at the far end of the hall. Jake's air gauge showed he had maybe 10 minutes left, 15 if he was lucky. Not much time to search a room and make it back to safety. The door was locked. Jake kicked it in, his axe splintering the wooden frame. Inside, the room was filled with smoke but not yet fully engulfed. 2 small beds, a shared dresser, children's drawings taped to the walls. And there, behind the dresser, just like Tommy had said, a small closet door barely visible in the shadows. "Emma!" Jake called out, his voice muffled by his mask. "Emma, my name is Jake. Tommy sent me to find you." A tiny whimper came from behind the closet door. Jake moved the dresser with strength born of desperation and pulled the door open. Inside, curled up in a ball among the winter coats, was the smallest person he'd ever seen look so terrified. Emma couldn't have weighed more than 40 pounds soaking wet. She had blonde hair in messy pigtails and wore a nightgown with cartoon unicorns on it. Her eyes were huge in her smoke-smudged face, and she was clutching a stuffed rabbit that looked like it had seen better days. "It's okay, sweetheart," Jake said softly, pulling off his mask so she could see his face. "I'm here to take you somewhere safe." Emma looked at him with the solemn intensity that only very young children can manage. "Are you an angel?" she asked in a whisper. The question hit Jake harder than the heat and smoke combined. "No, honey, I'm just a firefighter. But I'm going to get you out of here, I promise." He scooped Emma up in his arms, noting how she immediately wrapped her thin arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder. She smelled like smoke and fear and something else, something indefinably sweet and innocent that made Jake's chest tighten, with protective instincts he'd thought had died with his own daughter 7 years ago. The trip back down the hallway was a race against time and physics. The flames had spread since Jake's arrival, and the ceiling was starting to sag ominously. Emma clung to him without making a sound, her small body trembling but trusting. They made it to the stairwell just as a section of the third floor ceiling collapsed behind them, sending up a shower of sparks and burning debris. Jake's air gauge was flashing red. Maybe 5 minutes left, and they still had 2 flights of stairs to navigate. On the second floor landing, disaster struck. A burning beam, weakened by the fire, gave way and crashed down across the staircase, blocking their path to the main exit. Jake could hear voices below, his fellow firefighters calling for him, but there was no way through the debris. His radio crackled to life. "Morrison, report. We've lost visual on you. Trapped on second floor?" Jake responded, trying to keep his voice calm for Emma's sake. "Stairway blocked. Need alternate route. Working on it. Cap, hold tight." But Jake's air gauge said he didn't have time to hold tight. The needle was deep in the red zone now, and Emma was starting to cough from the smoke. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. The window at the end of the second floor hallway faced the back of the building. Jake remembered seeing the ladder truck positioning itself there when they first arrived. If he could get to that window, if the ladder was in position, they might have a chance. He made his way down the hallway, Emma's weight seeming to grow heavier with each step as his oxygen-starved muscles began to protest. The window was there, but when Jake looked out, his heart sank. The ladder was close, but not close enough. There was maybe a 4-foot gap between the window and the ladder platform. For feet. In normal circumstances, Jake could make that jump easily. But carrying a 6-year-old girl while wearing 60 pounds of gear and running on fumes? It was a hell of a risk. Emma lifted her head from his shoulder, her blue eyes meeting his through the smoke. "Are we going to die?" she asked with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who had probably faced loss before. Jake looked at this small, brave girl who had trusted him completely from the moment he'd found her hiding in that closet. He thought about Tommy waiting outside, probably watching the windows for any sign of his friend. He thought about all the calls he'd answered, all the people he'd saved, all the promises he'd kept. "No, sweetheart," he said firmly. "We are absolutely not going to die. Do you trust me?" Emma nodded solemnly. Good, because we're going to take a little ride together. Okay? I need you to hold on as tight as you can and don't let go no matter what. Can you do that for me? Another nod. Jake kicked out the window glass, clearing the frame as best he could. The ladder crew below had seen them and was working frantically to adjust their position. But it wasn't going to be close enough. Not quite. Morrison! A voice called from the ladder platform. It was Danny Rodriguez, the chief's son and one of Jake's most trusted firefighters. You crazy bastard. Don't even think about it. But Jake was already thinking about it. More than that, he was committed to it. He backed up a few steps, took a deep breath from his nearly empty tank, and ran. For a moment, they were flying. Jake felt Emma's arms tighten around his neck as they sailed through the smoke-filled air. For feet becoming 3, then 2, then they hit the ladder platform hard, Jake's knees slamming into the metal grating with enough force to send shock waves up his spine. But they were alive, they were safe, and Emma was still clutching her stuffed rabbit with one hand while holding on to Jake with the other. I've got you, Danny was saying as he helped steady them on the platform. I've got you both. As the ladder descended toward the waiting ambulance, Jake felt Emma relax in his arms. She looked up at him with those serious blue eyes and said, "Thank you for keeping your promise. That should have been the end of the story. Hero firefighter saves child. Everyone goes home." Another successful rescue to add to the journal. But as Jake would learn over the next few hours, the real story was just beginning. The Riverside Children's Home was a total loss. 42 kids were now homeless, scattered among emergency shelters and temporary foster placements throughout the city. The cause of the fire was determined to be faulty electrical wiring in the second-floor common room. A disaster waiting to happen that no one had seen coming. Jake found Tommy at the Red Cross shelter that had been set up at the local community center. The boy was sitting alone at a folding table, mechanically eating a peanut butter sandwich while staring at nothing. "Hey, buddy." Jake sat down across from him. "How are you holding up?" Tommy looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Is Emma okay?" "Really okay. She's fine. A little smoke inhalation, but she's going to be perfectly healthy. She's asking for you, actually." For the first time since Jake had met him, Tommy smiled. "Can I see her?" "Of course. But first, can you tell me something? You said Emma was your roommate's little sister. Where are your roommate and Emma's parents?" Tommy's expression shuddered. "Emma doesn't have parents. None of us do, really. That's why we were at Riverside. And my roommate was David, but he aged out last month. Turned 18 and had to leave. So it was just me looking out for Emma." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What about you, Tommy? Do you have family?" "Nope. Been in the system since I was 4. My mom died in a car accident and my dad." Tommy shrugged with the practiced nonchalance of a child who had learned not to hope for things that weren't coming. "He didn't want me. Said he couldn't handle raising a kid alone." The coldness in Jake's stomach spread outward. Here was this brave, selfless kid who had risked running toward a burning building to make sure someone would save his friend. A kid who had nobody in the world except the other lost children he'd been living with. "Where will you go now?" Jake asked quietly. "Emergency foster care," they said, "just until they can find something more permanent. But I'm 9 now and most people want babies. I'll probably age out at 18 like David did." Jake spent the next hour with Tommy and Emma, listening to their stories and trying to process the emotions churning in his chest. Emma, it turned out, had been at Riverside since she was 3. Her parents had died in a house fire. The irony wasn't lost on Jake, and she'd had no other relatives willing or able to take her in. Both kids were remarkably resilient, the way children often are in the face of circumstances that would break adults. They made jokes, they played simple games with items from the Red Cross supplies, and they took care of each other with a tenderness that made Jake's throat tight. As the day wore on and the reality of their situation became clearer, Jake found himself thinking about things he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. His empty house in the suburbs, the spare bedroom that had once been decorated for a little girl who would never come home, the life he'd put on hold after losing his wife and daughter in that drunk driving accident that had shattered his world into before and after. That evening, Jake called his sister Margaret in California. Margaret was a therapist who specialized in grief counseling, and she was one of the few people who understood the depth of Jake's loss. "I'm worried about you," she said after Jake had explained about the fire and the children. "This sounds like it's bringing up a lot of stuff for you." "Maybe," Jake admitted. "But Maggie, these kids. Tommy saved Emma's life by making sure I knew where to find her. And Emma, when I found her hiding in that closet, she asked me if I was an angel." "Jake, I know what you're going to say, that I can't replace Sarah and Lily, that taking in foster kids won't bring them back. But that's not what this is about." There was a long pause. "Then what is it about?" Jake stared out the window of his empty house at the carefully maintained yard that no one played in. The swing set he'd never had the heart to remove, gathering rust in the autumn air. "Maybe it's about the fact that I've spent 23 years running into burning buildings to save people, but I haven't saved the 2 kids who need saving the most. Maybe it's about finally understanding that sometimes the people you rescue end up rescuing you." The foster care process was complicated, but Jake had advantages that most prospective parents didn't. His job history, his psychological evaluations from the fire department, his financial stability, and his complete lack of a criminal record all worked in his favor. More importantly, he had the enthusiastic support of Tommy and Emma themselves. The social worker, a tired-looking woman named Linda Patterson, seemed cautiously optimistic. "It's unusual for someone to want to foster 2 unrelated children, especially when one is an older boy who's been in the system for years. Are you sure you understand what you're taking on?" Jake looked across the room where Tommy was helping Emma color a picture of a house with a big yard and a dog in front. Both kids had asked if he had a dog. When he'd said no, they'd immediately begun planning what kind of dog they should get together. "I understand that I'm getting the 2 best kids in the world," Jake said simply. "And they're getting someone who will never, ever give up on them." The transition wasn't seamless. Tommy had been hurt and abandoned enough times to be naturally suspicious of good things, and he tested Jake's commitment in a dozen small ways. Emma, despite her sweet nature, had nightmares and anxiety attacks that required patience and understanding Jake was still learning to provide. But slowly, carefully, they built something new together. Jake taught Tommy how to change the oil in his truck and how to cook basic meals. He sat with Emma during thunderstorms and learned to braid hair from YouTube videos that made them all laugh until their sides hurt. Tommy, it turned out, was brilliant with anything mechanical. Give him a broken radio or a bicycle with a flat tire, and he could fix it without even thinking about it. Emma was an artist, filling page after page with drawings of their new life together, pictures of Jake in his firefighter uniform, pictures of all 3 of them with the golden retriever they eventually adopted from the shelter, pictures of the family they were becoming. 6 months after the fire, Jake was sitting in his backyard watching Tommy teach Emma how to throw a curveball when his phone rang. It was Linda Patterson, the social worker. "Jake, I have some news about Tommy and Emma's case, about the fire at Riverside." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What kind of news?" "The fire investigation has been reopened. It turns out the electrical problem wasn't accidental. Someone deliberately tampered with the wiring." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone tried to burn down that children's home on purpose. And Jake, they think it might have been an inside job." Over the next few weeks, the investigation revealed a conspiracy that shook the local child services community to its core. The director of Riverside Children's Home, Robert Walsh, had been embezzling funds for years. When state auditors began asking questions, Walsh had decided that a tragic accident would be the perfect way to destroy the financial records and claim insurance money to cover his theft. What Walsh hadn't counted on was how much the children in his care meant to the people who worked with them, or how determined those people would be to uncover the truth. The night of the fire, Walsh had expected all the children to evacuate through the main exits, where they would be quickly accounted for and moved to safety. He hadn't expected Emma to hide, or Tommy to notice she was missing, or a firefighter to risk his life going back for one small girl who should have been just another casualty in his plan. Walsh was arrested on charges of arson, attempted murder, and embezzlement. The investigation revealed that he had been stealing money meant for basic necessities: food, clothing, medical care, from children who had already lost everything. "He tried to kill us," Emma said matter-of-factly when Jake explained what had happened. They were sitting on the couch in their living room. Emma curled up against Jake's side, while Tommy sat cross-legged on the floor with their dog, Rusty. "But he didn't," Tommy said fiercely, "because Jake saved us. And now we're a family." Jake looked at these two incredible children who had survived so much and somehow emerged with their capacity for love and trust intact. Children who had saved him as surely as he had saved them. "Yes," he said softly. "Now we're a family." A year later, the adoption papers were finalized in a courthouse ceremony that drew half the Denver Fire Department. Jake stood before the judge with Tommy on his left and Emma on his right, officially becoming the father he'd never expected to be again. In his speech at the celebration afterward, Jake talked about call number 12,848 and how it had changed his understanding of what it meant to save someone. "I spent my career thinking rescue was something I did for other people," he said, looking out at the faces of his friends, family, and fellow firefighters. "It took 2 kids and a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Whiskers to teach me that sometimes the person who needs rescuing the most is you." Tommy Jake Morrison and Emma Grace Morrison were in the front row, wearing matching t-shirts that read "My dad is a hero," and grinning like they had won the lottery, which Jake reflected as he watched them later that evening building a fort in the living room. Maybe they all had. Call number 12,848 had indeed been different from all the others. It was the call that reminded Jake Morrison that the best rescues aren't just about pulling people from burning buildings. Sometimes they're about pulling each other from the loneliness and loss that can consume a life more completely than any fire ever could. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that the children you save end up saving you right back. Years later, when Tommy graduated from high school with a full scholarship to study engineering and Emma won her first art contest, Jake would update his journal with one final entry about call number 12,848. Outcome: 3 lives saved. 1 family created. Promise kept. It was, he thought as he closed the worn leather book, the best entry he'd ever written. Sometimes the most important rescues happen long after the fire trucks have gone home. Sometimes the people we save end up being the ones who teach us what it really means to live. And sometimes, a promise made to a frightened child in the middle of the night becomes the foundation of everything beautiful that comes after.